Hello everyone, welcome to our new series, The Lightbulb Sessions. The Great British Entrepreneur Awards, in association with BT Skills for Tomorrow, have designed a free live stream series of Lightbulb Sessions to support small businesses and entrepreneurs with insightful, advice-driven sessions with the UK's brilliant entrepreneurial minds to illuminate their path to entrepreneurial success. You can find out more about BT Skills for Tomorrow by clicking on the link in the comment section or by visiting www.bt.com/skills for tomorrow. In today's session, Great British Entrepreneur Awards founder Francesca James will interview the UK's leading expert in successful podcasts, James Burtt. James has worked with over 100 plus clients to plan, produce, launch, grow, and monetize podcasts. He is a brand performance expert, podcast and media coach, and has personally created 3 iTunes Top 50 podcasts. Today, James and Francesca will identify top tips and advice on how you can start your own podcast, how to plan, record, and launch. There is an opportunity to ask questions during this session. If you have a question you'd like to ask James, you can pop this in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to these later on in the session. And with that, I'll pass over to our host today, Francesca James.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And thank you, James, for joining us. We've been talking for quite some time about setting up a podcast, and you've been trying to get us to do one. It's been something that has been on our list of things to do. But I think
hounding you. I think the term is hounding.
Yeah, that might be the term. But I think it's fair to say that there's probably, like a lot of entrepreneurs on this call, that podcasting has been something that's been on their mind, yet taking the leap is quite daunting when you don't know where to start. So hopefully by the end of this session, we will have lots of people ready to embark on their own podcast journey. So let's start off with the obvious one. What is the business case for creating a podcast?
Well, fundamental. First and foremost, thank you very much for inviting me. When you sent through the invite, I was like, would you like to do an event with the Great British Entrepreneur Awards? And it's with BT. I was like, oh, that makes me sound fancy. Yes, I would. I'll iron a shirt and everything. Not that it looks like it was ironed, but I promise it was. So the business case for podcasting is very simple. Your client base are listening to these podcasts. So if you're not there, they're listening to somebody else. There's some stats done last year. So in the UK, for example, there's an organisation called Radio, and they look at the radio audience and the listening audience of different stuff. And they've started to look at podcasting as part of, audience demographic data that they're picking up on. And last year, from 2018 to 2019, there was a 24% increase in the number of people who are listening on a weekly basis. So these are not people who listen to a podcast at some point. These are people who listen every single week. So it jumped from 6 million to 7.1 million people in a year. They now reckon, they haven't done the radar stats this year because they actually send out old school manual diaries. That's how they do it, which is ridiculous in this day and age, but that's how they do it. So they obviously haven't done it because of COVID restrictions, etc. But they estimate that by the end of this year, there'll be 10 million people who are listening to podcasting in the UK alone on a weekly basis. So the business case is your clients are there. If you're not, you're missing an opportunity.
Wow, well, the stats are pretty phenomenal. I guess there's quite a lot of people probably on this call thinking that they have a vague idea of what their podcast would be about and what it would cover. How would one best go about validating that idea and actually confirming that there are people out there that will listen to it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's 19 categories. There's 19 top line categories on iTunes. So, for example, there's pretty much any niche that you're in, you could do a podcast. Let's say you're an expert on, finger crochet. I bet there's a finger crocheting podcast. I mean, it might not be the most exciting listen, but I bet there is one out there. There's sport, art, business, entrepreneurship, investing, not-for-profit, health, fitness, mental health, family, spirituality, politics, news. There's 19 categories across iTunes. Within those categories, then you've also got between, say, 4 and 10 in some instances, subcategories within those sections. So there's sort of 19 niches, and then there's 5. So let's say there's 100 micro niches on iTunes. So your business would fit into one of those very, very easily. That makes sense. But in terms of how do you validate your idea? I guess it's like any other form of marketing. What's in it for the listening audience? Because what I get quite often is that people will come to me I'm trying to be vague about it and not give away the brand names, but brands will come to me. They're like, hey, we'd like to do a podcast about, XYZ. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Glad that you want to do it, but what's in it for the listener? Because, for example, no one's going to want to listen to an hour's worth of you sales pitching and punting your services every single week. So luckily, my background is in broadcast PR. So, I've worked with the likes of BMW, Nando's, Thomas Cook, Nissan, Stella Artois, PG Tips, Cafe Direct, Taylors of Harrogate, some of the biggest brands, in the UK and around the world. But what we'd always have to do in those instances when we were trying to get editorial coverage, which is what broadcast PR is all about, we'd have to create a story and a narrative around the subject that you want to talk about. So effectively, you need to look at it in two ways. There's the core message that you want to communicate, but how are you going to turn that into content that people are going to want to consume? People want to be either educated, informed, or entertained, and you have to do a mixture of the both. Ideally, all three if you can, but at least at all times you have to be doing one of the three, or else it's just not going to land with people. So, for example, back in the day when I worked with BMW, they came to me and said, look, and this was like years ago now, we've got this brake energy rejuvenation technology. So basically, like all cars have this nowadays, but 15 years ago when I started out, this was like mega. So when you put your foot on the brake, it used to pump energy back into the engine. And they were like, oh, can we do interviews about it? I was like, no, it's interesting to you, but fundamentally it's not going to be interesting to the listening audience. So we need to make a narrative around it. So we basically created a story. We did some stats and research about braking distances and road safety in different areas. Then we could go and pitch the radio stations and get them on, because we could say, hey, Swindon FM, not that there is a Swindon FM. Hey, Swindon FM, did you know that in your area there were 75,000 cases of road traffic accidents last year? 50% of these were caused by brakes and faulty brakes. We've actually got a leading expert from BMW who's going to come on and talk to your audience about why braking is important. So effectively we get to communicate the core message, but we do it in a way that entertains, informs, or educates the audience. So you need to look at what is it you want to say and how you're going to say it in a way that entertains that audience or engages that audience. I always say this to my clients, before you hit the record button, think what's in it for them. You have to have a really good idea of who's your target ideal listener avatar. What's in it for that person? Are you going to give them something of value, or are you just going to try and sales pitch them for an hour? Because if so, the brilliant thing with podcasting is that you control the narrative. The bad thing with podcasting is you control the narrative. So if you've got a good grasp on what's actually entertaining, interesting, or informing, great. If not, you don't want it to be a sales pitch. I had a client the other week and he did a whole load of training with me. And then I said to him, what's your show idea? And he just wanted to sell to people. And I couldn't get him out of the mode of selling. And I said, look, you need to go and be a guest on other people's podcasts. You don't need to be doing your own podcast, because no one's going to listen to a sales pitch about what you're going to talk about for 60 minutes. So what's in it for them? And what's your core message, and how you're going to deliver it in a way that engages the audience?
So yeah, that's really interesting. But going back to the business case and the sales opportunities that come from it, do you encourage if an entrepreneur is looking to do a podcast for business reasons to create sort of advert reels that go in, or is it more about becoming that expert and that respected voice, and the adverts are something that you wouldn't focus on? What would be your thoughts there?
It's a mixture of both, and it's kind of horses for courses. It depends. So I've worked with a lot of, for example, I've run a 7-figure coaching business and a 6-figure branding agency. All of that money, and I say that not to be like, oh, look how clever I am, but literally I generated all of that revenue indirectly via a podcast. I raised my profile via a podcast, so that I indirectly monetize that content. I actually switched over, because at one point I was getting 25,000 downloads a month. So I switched over to a new platform because they offered advertising. Now I was never interested in the advertising, but I just wanted to, because I'm a podcast expert, I needed to understand the process that they were going to walk people through in case it was a good thing for clients to do. So I did it. So bearing in mind, I've got a 7-figure coaching business, 6-figure branding agency, big podcast that's driven all that revenue. In terms of direct money and advertising sales for that podcast, I made $96. So it just goes to show that the advertising isn't necessarily the thing that you need to be doing. But what I've done for a lot of business owners and entrepreneurs and solopreneurs, it is being that authoritative voice within the marketplace. It is being that thought leader. It is the ability to, I've interviewed Rob Law, MBE, the guy who invented the trunky suitcase. I've interviewed Daniel Gray, who's the creator of Wallpaper for Men, the world's fastest growing male makeup brand. I've interviewed Grant Cardone, Mr. Universe. Elena Cardone. I've interviewed all these amazing people who are now in my network. I've interviewed venture capitalists who've got hundreds of millions of quid to invest in businesses. I never would have had the opportunity to be in their network and then be in my network if it wasn't for the podcast. However, conversely, I have worked with companies where they've come to me, they said, we want to, it's more than a thought leadership piece. We do want to sponsor, we want this to be a branded audio experience. So what I do sometimes, I will create a narrative for the story or create an angle for the story. And then the brand almost sponsors their own content. So for example, we had a teacher recruitment company. I was like, listen, no one's going to listen to a podcast, an 8-episode series for 60 minutes on teacher recruitment. Like, I don't even want to talk to you about it for 15 minutes on the phone, let alone listen to 60 minutes of it 8 times across the series. But what we can do is we can talk about stuff to do with teachers. What are the challenges? What's happening in schools? Let's talk to educators. Let's talk to the boards of governors. Let's talk to councils. Let's talk to people, new teachers and old teachers and head teachers and startup teachers. And then let's make the recruitment company be the sponsor of the podcast. So it's almost the Teachers Things podcast. It was called Teachers Things. The Teachers Things podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Aquinas Education. If you're looking to blah, blah, blah. And so we had a sponsored message from the makers of the podcast, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Getting into the nitty gritty and to the, if people are really thinking that this might be a way that they want to get their voice out and get their message out. Let's start with cost. How much does it actually cost to set up a podcast and to run a podcast? And I guess it's a bit of how long is a piece of string, but what's the entry point for people? So
the entry point, a lot of people come to me, they're like, look, I'd love to do a podcast, but I haven't got massive budgets. And I'm like, well, my friends, then you're in luck, because it doesn't have to cost you anything. Your entry point is that your mobile phone. You can literally, there's an app called Anchor. You can literally record on your phone, upload it via Anchor and syndicate it to iTunes, Spotify, etc. It will cost you nothing. It's free. I wouldn't advise everybody to do that, by the way, because Anchor's got some really odd terms and conditions where they own the IP of your content, which I'm not really a fan of. Anchor has been bought out by Spotify. They got bought for like $250 million, and Gary Vee was like an early stage investor into it. So it's a great opportunity. So yeah, you can do it for absolutely nothing. Use your iPhone or your Android phone, get the Anchor app, and you can upload for free. If you wanted to have a more polished and professional sounding podcast, like that mic there is called a Blue Ice Ball. That's 55 quid off Amazon. It's not going to trick people into thinking you're in a 2,000 quid an hour London recording studio, but it's a good enough broadcast quality microphone that does the job that it needs to do. So, but equally, you can spend thousands and thousands of pounds on equipment. It depends what you want to do, but to get you up and running, let's say, for example, the majority of the world is locked down, and sadly, in your instance, you're going to be like proper hardcore lockdown come 6 p.m. tomorrow. So people have got very used to doing interviews and podcasts via Zoom. So you don't need loads of fancy equipment. A USB microphone for 55 quid. Zoom you can get for free of charge at the moment, which is fantastic. Zoom records in video form and audio form. And then what I'd suggest people do is use a platform called Libsyn, which stands for Liberated Syndication. They've been around since 2004. And effectively, with a podcast, you need what's called a syndication software to spit your content out to other places. So when you download it from iTunes or Google or App Store or wherever, you're not actually taking it from Apple. You're taking it from a third party. Apple almost acts as the middleman. So you need a syndication software to send it out. And Libsyn costs from like $7 a month. So for literally 55 quid for a microphone, $7 a month for the syndication software, you could be up and running.
And let's move on to syndication, because so you've recorded on whatever equipment that you've chosen to do so. So could you walk us through what the next steps are in terms of choosing the right syndication programs, how you actually present it on there? Are there any pitfalls that people should be aware of? What are the timelines for getting something up and running and approved? Is there an approval process?
Yes, there is. Great question, actually, because a lot of people forget about this. I've had clients before who've gone to launch podcasts and they've got a launch day. They're like, oh, my podcast hasn't been approved by Apple. So let's cover that one off from the word go. Apple say that it can take up to 14 days to approve their podcast. I've never seen it take 14 days. The most I've ever seen it take is 4 working days. But you want to allow yourself. When I train clients, I've got a 14-day promo process that warms up the cold audience, so they're warm to the idea of the podcast by the time you come to launch it. But also that 14-day promo process protects people, because on the day one of promoing, I make people link up their syndication software to Apple, to Spotify, to TuneIn, to Stitcher Radio and all the other platforms, to make sure there's ample time for the approval process to happen. So yeah, 14 days it can take. I've never seen it take more than 5 days. In terms of the syndication stuff, effectively, once you've recorded, say on Zoom, and you've done a little bit of basic editing, which you can do on a variety of formats, you then put it onto something like a Libsyn, and then Libsyn effectively spits it out to all the other platforms. So Libsyn is where you host and you hold the content. So it's where it's almost like an iCloud or a Google Drive. It's that online hub where your content is sitting effectively, and then it spits out to these different places. Libsyn's great because it's already got official link ups with the likes of Spotify, so it links through to them directly, with Amazon Music, which is going to be more and more important because obviously that's the device, that's the back end that drives the Alexa and the smart voice devices. Ghana, which is a big app, got 150 million users in India. So Libsyn will spit your content out for you. There's different ways to set it up, and what you want to make sure of is that when you do set up on something like a Libsyn, or whether it be, there's others out there. So just to be fair, because in case there's anyone who's watching, well, what about the other ones? There's Podbean and Acast and Audio Boom. They do a very similar job. You put your content on there, you write your show notes and all that kind of stuff in there. You put your show artwork on there, and that spits out. The spitting out bit is kind of the same thing, and it's kind of horses for courses. What do you want to use? Libsyn, I only use Libsyn because I've used it 130 times. It's never, ever let me down. So that's why I use it. But in terms of, when you're setting up your software, whichever one you go for, make sure that much like you would if you're writing a blog or doing an article or SEO in the back end of your website, make sure you use SEO terms and keyword-rich phrases that could potentially help your show get found. Because what a lot of people do is be like, so I've got a show called Building the Brand. Okay, you're going to find me, excuse me, if you type in the word building the brand. But you might also put in UK entrepreneur, UK business conversations, interviews. So I make sure that I have as many ways of getting those keywords in as possible without it being like spam. Excuse me. I'm going to die a death on a live Zoom call. That's going to be embarrassing.
Just to jump in then, James, I've had a few people
Brand new bottle from GBEA.
I've got a couple of people asking if you could confirm the name of the app that you suggested. Libsyn?
Yeah, Libsyn. So Libsyn's the distribution platform. So LIB, Limo, Indigo, Bravo, Sierra, Yankee, November, Libsyn.com.
Brilliant. And the name of the microphone that you sent, I'm guessing that you could send us the link so that we can share that with the audience afterwards.
Yeah, no problem at all. If anyone wants to search for those, it's called a blue Snowball Ice. I'm just having a look on it now. Snowball Ice by a company called Blue.
Brilliant. We'll put together a bit of a toolkit for any tools or products that we've sort of talked about in this session. We'll send those over to people. I've got
a little download if you want it actually, which actually lists down like the real basic stuff and how to do it for cheap. And then sort of, because what I always encourage my clients to do is get it up and running for as cheap as possible, low hanging fruit, because otherwise I'm a qualified coach. I know that if people don't do it easily, they just won't do it at all. So get a 55 quid mic, get it up and running, and then, you could buy a 150 quid mic if you need it further down the line, or you could get a mixing desk if you need it, but just get started to start with. That's the most important thing. So I'll send you that list in case it's useful for the people who are watching.
That'd be fantastic. just going back to the approvals, you mentioned that you had a client that didn't get approved. What would be the main reasons that a podcast wouldn't get approved?
So it wasn't, it didn't get approved because they hadn't done it in the right way. So when iTunes, effectively, when you link through to iTunes, they're looking to make sure that there is an MP3 file, so some form of audio file linked to the account. They're also making sure that there is a piece of artwork there. So you need to make sure you have both of those things in your syndication software before you link it to iTunes. So the client in question there, they'd linked to iTunes, it had approved, but then they'd taken down the test file. So then at some point there was an account which didn't have audio on it. So then they said that's a spam account. They closed it down. So that was the problem. So when you set up your podcast, what I always encourage my clients to do, because you need to have or you don't need to, but it's always a good idea to have license-free music for for your intro and your outro. I basically get a little voiceover done for 30 seconds, which is, this is the Building the Brand podcast, in-depth conversations with people who are building exciting brands and businesses. If you're an entrepreneur, blah, 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 this is the show for you. I have that voiceover done on top of the music. Then I upload that to Libsyn, and then I link it through to iTunes. So if somebody accidentally finds the show on iTunes before launch day, there's a piece of content there, but also you just need it to validate with iTunes. So, but make sure, and this is one thing I always tell clients again and again and again, make sure that your Libsyn account always has an MP3, a piece of artwork, and an episode on there when you're validating it. So if for example, you don't want that test file to be there on launch day, upload your other episodes, and then when it's been approved, you can see it on iTunes, then delete the other one off.
Okay. And you talked about the intro then, and that you had you've got a voiceover done. My next question was, you mentioned post-production. I guess that sort of you've got the raw recording. What are the next steps to make it sound like, with the music and with the editing effects? Are there any top tricks that you give there? Any tools that people should be looking at? Any things that they should be avoiding?
Yeah, again, my top tip, and it sounds overly simple, is to just keep it simple. So, for example, when I launch shows for clients, when I do it as an agency owner, we do it for people, so we can make it as complicated as we want because we've got professional producers. But if I'm training people to go off and do it by themselves, again, I'll try and make it as simple as possible. So things like getting a voiceover and getting some music done makes it really simple to sound more polished than the average podcast. And it doesn't have to take you lots of time. So, for example, you could go on to, there's a website called premiumbeat.com, and you can download license-free music from there. It costs $49, but you buy the license for perpetuity, i.e. forever. So, and you need to have license-free music. Don't use music that is licensed, because Spotify will shut your podcast down. So go to Premium Beat. Then I'll go to, you can go to Fiverr, for example. Again, with Fiverr, sometimes you get what you pay for. Sometimes you get incredible value. So you can find a voiceover artist there. So you can get your voiceover and your music done, get them to produce it for you. And then you literally have an MP3 file that you can drag and drop into your sort of editing software. Again, when I train people, I try and make it as simple as possible. So there's a great little software called Audacity, Audacity, and it's open source editing software. So it's free of charge, and it's so simple to use. It's really, really good. Again, I've got a little training video on how to actually edit a podcast to make it sound professional in 30 minutes. So I'll send that across to you in case you want to share it out with the guys. I'm more happy for you to share that out. But yeah, so I would literally, I do a daily podcast, and I can voice it and edit it and add my stuff to it and do the show notes and put it onto Libsyn and have it loaded in under 20 minutes. But that's because I've done like thousands of them at this point. But really, again, I say to people, you don't need to especially for like Zoom call one-to-one kind of interview stuff, other than the sort of like the chit chat bit at the beginning before you hit the record button or get started. And the bit at the end where you're like, oh, thanks so much for that. I really appreciate it. I'll send you some links, blah, blah, blah. You only need to chop those two bits off. And then the majority of that middle bit, you don't really need to do too much stuff too. I know some people, they'll produce it and they'll take out every on or stumble or pause. I'm just like, okay, fine. I get it if you want it to say. It depends on the podcast you're making. If you're doing like a science-based podcast or a tech-based podcast, yes, it needs to sound incredible because that's kind of like the brand of the podcast. But if it's informal chat, like this conversation could be made into a podcast, I wouldn't cut out any of the bits. I just chop out the beginning and the end, and makes the editing process quite simple. So as I say, go to Audacity and download that for free. As I say, it's open source software, so it's free of charge, and just have a little bit of a play around with it. So then you can import your raw file of your chit chat, your intro, your outro, cut them together. And again, I'm making it sound overly simple, but it doesn't have to be you don't have to have a degree in audio soundscape production to make a good sounding podcast, despite what people would have you believe.
Fantastic. And in terms of other assets that you're going to need when you're uploading, you talked about the images and stuff, is there anything more than the sort of the podcast cover that people should be thinking about? Is there, I guess, marketing your podcast you talked about earlier? I'm guessing you're going to suggest that there's a number of assets that people create, sound bites as well. Are there any specific tools or techniques that you'd use to or suggest to people to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what you need for the podcast, you only need the artwork, but you do need artwork, and it has to be square. It has to be a minimum of 1400 pixels by 1400 pixels, maximum of 3000 by 3000, because iTunes gives you those parameters for whatever reason. So that's what you need. But then in terms of what you want from a marketing standpoint, I always, with the clients that we work with, we have what we call countdown graphics. So we have a selection of 7 graphics that they can use in the 14-day promo process to, again, warm that audience up. So it features like the artwork, and it features, 5 days to go, 2 days to go, live now. So it's always different images, but always using the artwork. So again, people don't get bored of seeing the same thing because it's not the same image, but they get used to seeing the artwork, if that makes sense. So we use that kind of stuff, which I think is really useful to do. Again, if you use a Fiverr designer or whoever you've got, make sure they do those kind of launch graphics for you, because it does make a big difference. Then the other thing that's really good for promo, I'm just trying to see it at the same time if I can. I've just sent some to a client this morning. If I could send you a couple of examples quickly. The other thing you want is what's called an audiogram. Oh, here you go. So, for example, this is a client that we're working on. So these are countdown graphics. So 2 days, 2 hours to go, 5 days to go, 24 hours to go. So you can see there, the artwork's always featuring, and it's always so people get used to seeing it, but it's a different image each time, slightly. So I suggest that you do those kinds of things. That's really good. And then the other thing that's really good for growing engagement is what's called audiograms. So like video, a huge majority, I think it's 80% of online traffic is now video. People will watch videos even if they don't have the sound on. So, for example, if you put an audio clip out or you put a graphic clip out, people can scroll past that. Or if you just had a sound bite, people wouldn't necessarily listen to it. But if you have an audiogram video, that can work really nicely. So that's basically, and audiograms you can either have, if we were recording this, we could take a clip of this and put it into a nice little frame and stick it on, Insta. So they're basically like sub 60-second clips that kind of work outside of context, if that makes sense. So we create all of those for clients. You can make them really complex and complicated if you need to, but equally what we do and what our design team at the agency does is they will create sort of standard templates that we're going to use across all of the client assets. So then we can make those audiograms quite quickly. And there's a couple of really good apps for audiograms. One's called Wave, WAVVE, I think it is, .com. And the other one is Headliner. And both of those are like between $10 and $15 a month. And you can literally upload an image to it and add like one of those moving waveforms and subtitle it and all that kind of good stuff, which just makes it that little bit more engaging for people.
Yeah. And talking about engaging and keeping engagement, is there an optimum length of time that a podcast should be, do you think?
No. But I'll expand on that rather than just going no, because people always think, right, well, how long has it got to be? Back in the day, they did some research and they found the sweet spot was 53 minutes. I don't know why it was, but they'd done some stats. But this was like 2 or 3 years ago when I first started in podcasting. I was getting really like geeky on the days, like, oh, how long should I make it? But effectively, a podcast should be as long as it's interesting. That's it. There's podcasts out there that are a minute long intentionally. There's podcasts that are out there that, Joe Rogan will talk to Elon Musk about, transcendental meditation and, chips for the brain for 4.5 hours. So anything between 1 minute and 4.5 hours, you're kind of good to go. However, having said that, the average commute is probably between 30 and 45 minutes. We're very programmed as a nation. We're used to 30-minute TV programs. We're used to, radio programming sort of 30-minute chunks and increments. So 30 to 45 minutes is probably a good point. But what I'd say there is that the great thing with podcasting is that you don't have to be stuck to a formula. When I used to be on the radio, you had to be finished at a certain time. You had to play the adverts at a certain time. You had to do certain stuff at certain times. You don't have to do it with podcasting. So let's say, for example, you're doing an interview with somebody and 30 minutes in, you're a bit bored of the conversation. If you're bored, the audience is going to be bored. Wrap it up. Equally, if you're getting to 45 minutes and you're like, oh my God, I could talk to this guy or girl for another hour, don't cut it short just because you want to get it into that 45-minute window, if that makes sense. So there's no hard and fast rules as long as it's interesting. But I understand that answers like how long is a piece of string.
Yeah, 2 questions on the back of that, and I'm going to ask them back to back because otherwise I'll forget. The first one is how long is it? I guess when you're deciding on a time for a length, a duration for your podcast, your audience, if you've built that up, are going to have an expectation. So I guess you don't want to have a series of 15-minute podcasts and then hit them with a 3.5-hour one. So I guess would the advice there be to serialize that and to break it down into key topics maybe? And the second question I want to come back to is, you might not have the answer for this, but you talked about the commute. Now, obviously, we're in a wildly different world than we were this time last year or even a few months back. And it would be interesting to see if there is any data or research that's been done on changing trends of listener habits during lockdown and the new normal.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure because, again, all of this sort of the big data people haven't been doing the surveys in the way that they normally did. But prior to COVID, 23% of listening happened in the car or sort of on the commute. I think it was like 10 or 12% happened in gyms and working out. The vast majority of listening, interestingly, even pre-COVID, actually happened in the home, which I was really surprised about because I just expect that, all consumers are like me. They go to the gym, they go out for a walk, or they listen to it while they're doing the gardening or the washing up. But yeah, the vast majority, 40%, happens in the home. So that means if you've got a brand where you really need to be able to explain stuff to people, you can say to people, hey, I'm going to coach you on this today. Hey, I'm going to go into depth on this today. I'm going to break down, how the reticular activation system works within psychology. Grab a piece of paper and a pen because I'm actually going to give you some notes. We launched a podcast last week for an influencer guy called Danny Allen Page. And he consistently, he's grown his Instagram following from like 1,000 people to 50,000 in under a year. And he's made 200 grand in the process. So he knows his stuff when it comes to Instagram. And he gets like 130% listening of his podcast. And when you look at that, you're like, well, hang on a second, how can you have 130%? It's because people listen back to the same episode again and again. And he always gets people who are like, I'm listening for the third time, still taking more and more notes. So if you've got a brand where you need to educate people, it works really, really nicely. But yeah, as I say, I know that audience listening has gone up during COVID, but I don't want to put a number on it because there's loads of people like, oh, it's gone up 75%. I'm like, of course it has. Okay, sure. But that hasn't been proven yet. But listening audience is the general common or consensus is that it has gone up during COVID, and it was already 40% happening at home anyway. So I think home listening is going to be even bigger than it was. That's the world's most obvious statement. I'm going to make no news headlines with that fact. In terms of the sort of the 15-minute episode for a certain amount and then the 3.5 hour, yes, like you've sort of beautifully put it there, people kind of get used to the content in a certain way. So you don't want to have 15-minute pods and then all of a sudden you've got 4 hours because people won't listen to it. And to your further point, but so sorry, for example, with my building the brand episodes, each week I do an in-depth conversation with someone who's building an interesting brand. But I'm also now doing 10 to 15-minute episodes where I am just talking about building my business because I'm building it from scratch in COVID, from home, in the spare room, blah, blah, blah. So I'm literally taking people on the journey of creating this brand and business, the Ultimate Podcast Group, which I now run. So I've got, an hour-long podcast or 15-minute podcast, but I kind of... I explain the context of the content within the intro, if that makes sense. So there's not like, oh, why is this one only 15 minutes? Because you know why it's 15 minutes. But to your point there about if you've got would you break something down into like a series? Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things we've just done for an expert coaching client of ours. He had a great series. He had, I think it was like 15 hours worth of content on what's called Conquer the Crisis. He had these amazing speakers coming and do these keynotes for his in-person inner circle mastermind. I said, look, rather than dropping all of this as one thing, obviously it's much too long because it's 15 hours. We might be able to get some like publicity around it, but ultimately it would have been horrific for like listening numbers. I was like, let's break this down into a series. So we've actually created a whole series just on that subject. Then we're going to do another series in January, which will be on how to scale up. Then we're going to do another series in March, which will be on how to team up. So we've broken down the methodology that he teaches. We've broken it down into series-based podcasts. We've done it for Europe's largest health tech innovation event called Giant Healthcare. They've got so much stuff that they could talk about. I was like, look, let's do a series about tech innovations. Then we could talk about VR in the next series. Then we could talk about remote learning or whatever it may be to break it down for people. So yes, to answer your very succinct question with a very long answer, you could, if you had 3 hours of content, I would chunk it down. And if you are coming up with a series concept, a concept for your podcast, if there's stuff that you coach or you teach or you're an expert in, or there's different sort of models of how you deliver your service, by all means, you can break it into series. Series have become a very standard way for people to consume podcast content. We're getting more and more used to it. So people will listen in for 8 episodes, then they'll be used to like a 6-week gap, and you can come back for a season 2. So that works really nicely.
Well, that was actually my next question. So maybe you there's a psychic element going on here, because I was going to say, how many episodes should you have to launch with? And, typically then what would a series look like?
So I always encourage people to launch with 3 episodes, and I have 3 episodes on launch day. The reason for that is because you want to school the algorithm effectively, or play the algorithm. So when you're a new show, any activity that happens on your account is worth, I reckon, between 30 and 50 times that of an established show. And that's not me just picking a number out of thin air just because it sounds good. That's based on, as I mentioned before, I had a podcast that was doing 25,000 downloads a month. We were consistently in the top 100, never really dropped out of it. Every time we released a new episode, we get a spike of listeners, jump back up into the top 20. Then we sort of gradually during the week go down to within the top 100. And so the sort of cycle continued. Didn't put out an episode for 3 weeks at the beginning of 2018 because I was on holiday. I went to this like fancy like Thailand location that didn't have any internet. I was like, well, I just won't bother doing the podcast. What's the harm? I deserve a break. Big mistake, because when we came back, we'd fallen out of the iTunes top 200 and we never got back in again. Even when we had Grant Cardone on, for example. Oh, sorry, we did. We jumped back into number 72 when we had Grant Cardone on. Grant Cardone's got 6 million fans. He drove a lot of traffic to that podcast, and even that wasn't enough to get us back into the charts. So yeah, you need to have that consistency of content. So when you're a new show, I reckon that for every one piece of activity, whether it be a download, a rating, or a review that you get, it's worth, as I say, 30 to 50 times what that would be of an established show. So you launch with 3 shows. Show number 1 is going to be a pilot, or what I call a pilot. So it's going to be 5 to 15 minutes long. It's going to be you explaining who you are, what you're all about, what's your credibility, what the listener's going to get, again, what's in it for them, how often you're going to put the show out, what kind of guests, what kind of entertainment, information and education are they going to get from the show, and maybe a couple of clips from future episodes. That's what you want to do for episode 1. The reason why you want to keep it intentionally short is because what you want people to do is then go on to episode 2 and 3 in that same listening session. So to your point earlier, how long should the podcast be? Let's say we're going to listen for 30 minutes on our commute. If you've got a 15-minute pilot, naturally my phone, if I hit the subscribe button, will start playing episode 2. So effectively, we can get 2 bites of the same cherry. So let's say, for example, we can drive 100 people to your podcast. You don't need mega numbers. Let's say we can drive 100 people to your podcast, but each of those 100 people are worth 50 times that for each download they give you. So that 100 people downloading once is worth 5,000 downloads for a more established show. If we do the pilot show trick and we make them download 2 shows at the same time, effectively on day 1 with 100 people, we've got the same impact as what you would have as 10,000 listeners for a more established show. So that's how it works. So yeah, 3 shows. There's other people out there who say you should launch with 10 shows. I just think that's too much. People already feel like they're missing out. They're too far behind. I've done it. Chris Evans launched his show last week with 10 shows. And I already feel like I'm missing out because now each week he's putting content out, but I've not listened to the one before. So I think that's too much. So yeah, I always tell, and I've launched 127 podcasts. 85 to 90% of the people that I work with end up in the iTunes top charts. So I'm not saying that, you've got to listen to me, but it's been tested a few times now, if that makes sense. So 3 episodes works really nicely for the launch. And if you're going to do a series, you want to have a minimum of, if it's a story-based podcast, you can get away with 6 episodes and that kind of like pilot show. But I normally suggest to clients about 8 episodes because it's enough meat on the bones for people to get interested in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. Just a reminder that if anyone's got any questions, pop them in the Q&A. We've answered a few as we're going along. But just back to your point, I'm assuming that the majority of people on this call, they're on this session because they haven't launched yet, and therefore they've still got that very critical period of engagement ahead of them when they do launch. What would be some tips and tricks for ensuring that you're really capitalizing on on that sort of springboard time in terms of getting listeners?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, with all the clients that I work with, we have this 14-day promo process. So it's literally about, and then this is, again, it's been tried and tested. Anything less than 2 weeks, and people don't feel like bought in enough to the journey of the creation of this podcast. Anything more than 2 weeks, and people are like, dude, I get it. You launched your podcast. Shut up talking about it. Just let me know when it comes out, and I'll download it. So 2 weeks is that kind of sweet spot where you've been talking about it enough that people are like, oh, I support that. I've seen him working hard on creating that, and it's not too long. So then literally what you do for that 14-day promo process, it's kind of, it sounds a bit overly simple and a bit Gary Vee-esque, but document the journey of creating that show. So for example, a selfie with your new microphone, or unboxing your microphone when it turns up. Again, from like, if you're a coach or an expert, or you want to be an authoritative figure or a thought leader within your marketplace, chances are that you're known as being the expert within your space anyway, or people perceive you to have an expert level of knowledge. There's not very many opportunities within business and branding where you can show a level of vulnerability which doesn't decrease your credibility. But with this, it absolutely is. Let's say you're an expert coach, for example. I tell all my clients, you've got to get outside of your comfort zone to achieve what they want in life, blah, blah, blah. Very like generic coaching message, I understand that. But if that's kind of the thing that you're putting out, there's not many opportunities. But I tell everyone about comfort zones. There's your comfort zone, your stretch zone, your panic zone. Which zones do you operate in, blah, blah, blah. And for me, recording audio, weirdly, is actually a stretch zone. I've spoken on stages with Les Brown. I've interviewed the likes of Grant Cardone, but sitting there with a blank piece of paper, with a microphone, and wondering what I'm going to talk about, this is kind of my stretch zone activity. So maybe you guys can relate to that as well. That's the kind of messaging that I'll be putting out with it. And I'll be sharing, like I say, getting your equipment, learning the process, learning how to edit, screenshots of you interviewing your guests. I like to do what's called A/B testing as well. So maybe you've got a couple of options for your artwork. Even, by the way, this is a bit of a hack. Even if you've got your artwork nailed down, you know which one you're going to choose, put it out to your audience, put a couple of options and go, hey, do you prefer A or B? It creates that engagement. Same thing with the voiceover and the theme music. If you've narrowed it down to say 3 or 4 tracks that you really like, put it out to your community and say, hey, I'd love to get your feedback on this. We did it actually for a client once. We did that, and it was brilliant. I've never seen this happen before. She had like a closed community, which wasn't massive numbers, like 1,000 odd people, something like that. And she put out the top 2 choices of the music that my production guys had chosen. And these are guys who've worked for the BBC and they've produced stuff for millions of hours millions of downloads of content. So we're pretty good at picking stuff. So we picked these like top tracks, and she this client put in her favorite 2, put it out to her audience. And one member of the audience said, hey, and she did a poll. She's like, which one do you prefer? And this member of her community was like, oh, I really like these, but it just doesn't quite feel like you. Hope you don't mind. I've done a bit of my own digging. I think this track's better. So she put this track in there. 17 people then upvoted this other track. So we ended up going with the choice of the person in the community. So now that whole community is super engaged in the process of building that podcast, because they've literally had a vested interest. They've had a hand in making that show. So it's that kind of content, documenting the process across the 14 days is what works really, really well to build up that level of engagement. Because what you're trying to do there is trying to take your cold market and make it warm or hot. So by the time you come to launch day, it's not like, hey, I've got a podcast, because everyone's got a podcast. That's the perception. Everyone's got a podcast right now. They haven't. There's only 1.3 million podcasts, but I get why the perception is that everyone's got a podcast. So what you don't want to do is just go, hey, I've got a podcast. It's on Apple. Go and download it. People buy into the journey. People buy into the learning. People buy into the story behind the story. They don't buy into the polished end product quite as much. So yeah, document the journey for that 14-day promo process, and use things like the artwork, the audiograms. There's a way when I train clients, I make people say stuff on specific days in specific ways to make sure that it engages the audience in the right way. But yeah, essentially document the journey of creating that podcast for 2 weeks.
Brilliant. Well, would you believe it? I think we're almost out of time. There's a couple of really simple questions to answer, James, that I just want us to go over. Actually, there are 2 asking the same. Could you confirm the name of the software that you'd recommend for the voiceover and music?
Yeah, so it's premiumbeat.com.
Yeah.
Is for the music. It's been bought by Shutterstock. It's like 45,000 unlicensed tracks, basically. Like unlicensed music 5-10 years ago was horrendous, like jazz, like panpipe, jazz, and elevator music. But nowadays you've got they've got like Emmy award nominated producers who literally just produce unlicensed tracks or tracks you can buy the license to. So Premium Beat for the music, and then Fiverr for voiceovers.
Yeah, just to clarify.
Premiumbeat.com.
Yeah, BEAT. I think Chloe can probably put the link in there. And Fiverr, I think, is Fiverr with a double R at the end, I think. I can't.
Yes, I think it is, yeah. And my agency produces these sorts of things as well. So if you just want someone to, because what I get a lot of the time is people come to me like, oh, I'd love to do a podcast, but the artwork, the music, blah, blah, we handle all that for you. it's not a sales pitch, but if you're like busy and you just want it done for you, then we can handle all that for you. But there are, cheaper options than paying a production company like mine. So Premium Beat is where I get all of my tracks from. I now don't use Fiverr because I've got an in-house voiceover guy, but there's some great talent on Fiverr. Just with Fiverr, just make sure what you're buying, because with Fiverr, it can look like, it's £8.17 to get 100 words spoken. That's quite good. Then when you go into it, if you want to use it for broadcast rights, you have to pay them another 25 quid. And if you want them to read the script, they charge you 7 quid. And if you want to mix it together for you, it could be like another 40 quid. And before you know it, that £8.17 gig on Fiverr has cost you £130. So just be careful what you're buying. Also, with voiceover artists, they will read whatever is on the page. So double check, triple check, get somebody else to read it before you send them the script, because they will charge you if they have to revoice anything. That's just how they work. And also, if you've got anything that needs sort of, if you've got like a funny surname or the name of the show's a bit odd or obscure, phonetically spell it out for them so you know how they want. So they know how you want them to pronounce it. Because again, otherwise, if you go back to go, hey, you said my surname wrong, chances are they go, well, it's another 17 quid.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, we've got 2 more questions in here, but one of them I think that we're going to include in our follow-up, which I think we covered earlier, which was around which channels you'd recommend to market a brand new podcast. So I think we can include that sort of top tip sheet that we talked about earlier, James, and we'll get that out to attendees. Someone's asked, is it okay to pre-record a series and slowly release? I'm usually really busy, so worried that if I miss a week, if it was done weekly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what you need to do. Consistency is key. And that example that I gave you where I went off on this like Thailand holiday for 3 weeks, like, what harm's it going to do? And then never got back into the iTunes top charts with that particular podcast was proof that you need to have that consistency. I say to people, you need to be releasing a podcast on at least a weekly basis. And I've had people who are like, I definitely couldn't commit to that. I'm like, well, don't do it then. If you can't commit to once a week, don't start. But to that person's question, yes, batch record it, get it all done in advance, and then you can drip feed the content out. Libsyn, for example, you can actually produce everything, upload it to Libsyn, and you can schedule the content so Libsyn can put it out for you on a weekly basis. You can do it all in advance. We work with Natasha Hamilton, who used to be in Atomic Kitten. She's been in the music game for 20 years and has done 10 million record sales. So she's very busy. She's got multiple stuff going on. She's got multiple brands that she still runs, and a lot of like media engagements and stuff. So we literally sit down with her once every kind of 6 weeks, and we'll record 3 or 4 episodes with her guests. So she gets like a month's worth of content done in a morning, effectively, by batch recording it. Because the thing with podcasting, if you just sort of like do it on a daily basis or you do it on a weekly basis, it can end up taking like a chunk of your time. Whereas if you said, right, I'm going to, on once a month, I'm going to go, that's my podcast day. I'm going to record with everyone in the morning. I'm going to edit in the afternoon. I'm going to upload it. Then your month's worth of content is done in a day rather than it being 3 hours every week, which can end up being a bit of a chore. And that's the thing that stops people. When it becomes a chore, then people stop, and then you won't do it for a week. Then you see your engagement levels dropping. You'll be like, can't be bothered again now. And then before you know it, it's something stupid. Like back in the day, 70% of podcasts never got beyond episode 7. I think there's more people who are getting past that point now, but there's definitely that consistency is absolutely key.
Fantastic. Look, James, I could talk to you about this for another good hour or so, but we are out of time. I'm going to pass over to Chloe just before we finish, but I think that if anybody from this session does go on to create their own podcast, please do share them with us and the community, because we'd love to check them out. And just to pass over to Chloe to wrap things up and say once again, huge thank you to yourself, James.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And if anyone's got any questions or queries, I think Chloe put our LinkedIn details, didn't she? Just add me on LinkedIn. You've got any questions, I'm more than happy to help.
Thank you, James and Francesca, for joining us today and sharing your expertise and knowledge. What a great kickoff to our Lightbulb Sessions. You can join our next Lightbulb session at the same time next Thursday, as we'll be joined by Faraz Aji of Clerkenwell Brothers to discuss building a brand, narrative to visualization. If there is anything you'd like to catch up on from today's session, we'll be sending out a replay of this recording later on today. You can find the replay and future sessions at www.lightbulb-sessions.heysummit.com or by clicking on the link in the comment section. You'll also be able to find the top tip sheet with links of equipment and channels later on this page too. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you again, James and Francesca.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.